Hello, I'm Sarah Barth, Executive Director of Semper Virens Fund. Thank you for joining us for another in our Under the Redwoods webinar series in which we explore the beauty, the science, the inspiration, the economics of redwoods. Really everything redwoods is subject to our Under the Redwoods webinar series. Thank you to Sharp Investments, who has been sponsoring us with this webinar series. We appreciate their support. And I am delighted that the speaker we have here today with us is Dr. Brian Woodward. This is the fourth in our webinar series in which we cover the elements. We covered air, land, water, and now today we're going to be discussing fire. And we'll be looking at redwoods and their relationship to fire. And I can't think of anyone better to do this than Dr. Brian Woodward. He is the University of California's Cooperative Extension Forest Advisor for Santa Cruz, San Mateo, and Santa Clara County. So he literally lives, breathes, and works redwoods and fire in redwoods here in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And he's been doing that kind of analysis and study since his PhD work in the same area. He is a researcher, an ecologist, and more. And recently, we're especially grateful to him for having joined Semper Virens volunteer leadership structure and serving on our land and stewardship committee. So he's always a source of good advice, and now he's going to give us a broader background. So Brian, welcome to Under the Redwoods.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate the introduction. Everybody can see my screen okay? Okay, great. So today I am going to be covering post-fire ecology of coast redwood forests. This is a topic that's definitely near and dear to me. I hope that today, after walking away from this presentation, everyone, if you don't already have it, has a real great appreciation for just how amazing coast redwood is when it responds to fire, but also a recognition that this is a system in flux, that modern forest conditions have altered the relationship between redwoods and fire, and that we need to consider our stewardship practices moving forward as a result. So I first started thinking about how redwoods responded to fire, as Sarah mentioned, back in my graduate degree. And that was following the Chetco Bar Fire. It was a fire that burned the northernmost stand of redwoods, actually right over the border into Oregon. At that time, it really seemed like this unique opportunity. There'd been very few fires in the Coast Redwood Range in recent decades. And this gave me an opportunity to look at how these systems responded to fire for the first time in quite some time. As many of us know, just in the past 6 or 7 years, a lot has changed since 2017. And, the 2020 lightning fires occurred, and that burned redwood forest from, Mendocino to Sonoma down to Santa Cruz. And it's that year that really, I think, altered my perception, but also altered the perception of a lot of my colleagues just as to the size, scale, and effects that fire can really have in coast redwood forests under modern forest conditions. So that's where I'm going to be spending a good amount of my time today. But before we get into that, let's just go ahead and think about the context of fire and the coevolution of coast redwoods with fire. So there's no doubt that redwoods and fire have been interlinked for thousands upon thousands of years. Indigenous fire stewardship has absolutely been a key influence in the development of coast redwood forests over the last 10,000 years. The stand structure and composition that we see in our old growth forests is directly linked to this. I also say that lightning is an infrequent but impactful force in coast redwood forests, particularly in the pre-suppression era. So if you think, along the coast of California, we don't see a lot of lightning, but just one strike every few years could have been really impactful when no one was there to put out the fires. So we generally consider coast redwood forests to have this relatively frequent, low to moderate severity fire regime. And as a result, coast redwood forests, they display a number of disturbance and fire adapted traits, the ways that they respond to fire, the ways that they recover to fire over time. And coast redwood forests also respond to fire differentially across the many types of structures that we have in the redwood range, the compositions or the species that are present, as well as the climates. You know, we have redwood forests from the southwestern corner of Oregon down to Big Sur, all the way out to Napa County. So the forests in those conditions are going to be interacting with fire a little bit differently as the result of climate and the fire conditions that are present in those regions. I think one of the most important things we can acknowledge when we explore the relationship of coast redwood with fire today is that our forests have been modified considerably over the past 150 years. And when it comes to the response of these systems to fire, structure really matters. You know, the forests on the right, old growth forests, are just a small percentage of what coast redwood forests look like within the range. The vast majority of them look like that on the left. That's a young forest in Nicene Mark State Park. Or that in the middle, a maturing forest in between the young and old growth forests. So when we think about how they respond, we have to recognize that each of these forest types really has a very different resistance and resilience compared to that old growth condition, which we often use as a reference for fire, because we think when we go back to fire history studies and we can look at an old growth tree and see that it's withstood, 10, 15, 20 fires throughout its lifetime, we know that that particular tree is incredibly resilient to fire. But we're really still learning how forests like that on the left and that in the middle compare. Another really important component to consider when we're thinking about the response of redwood forests to fire is that it's not just about the redwoods. So, a typical coast redwood forest community often has Douglas fir, tan oak, bay laurel, madrone, a really rich shrub layer, and all of these species interact when a fire occurs. And each species also has different fire adaptations, and that means they have different resilience and different rates of recovery over time. Two really common conifers in the coast redwood range, probably not news to anyone here, are coast redwood and Douglas fir. And I always find it interesting because these species actually respond to fire in really different ways. So let's go ahead and look at some of the traits that coast redwood forest communities have to help resist and recover from fire. I always like to start with bark because everyone has heard about the importance of bark in resisting fire in trees from the coastal California to the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. It's an incredible important force in helping trees resist the effects of fire. In the coast redwood range, here's 3 examples of trees that have very different bark structures and thickness. So in the case of Douglas fir, very thick bark, but it's very hard and textured and it really resists fire. In coast redwood, if you've ever hugged a redwood tree, you've probably noticed that the bark is really soft and stringy. And in some cases, that bark is kind of wick-like and can actually be quite flammable. But the thickness helps protect the tree from the effects of fire as well. Coast redwood bark is really interesting because it can actually attract fire up the tree. And there's a lot of different hypotheses as to why that might be beneficial for coast redwood. One is potentially that bringing fire up into its canopy can transfer it over to Douglas fir, which results in its mortality and gives more opportunity for coast redwood to establish in new areas. Pacific madrone, in contrast to these 2 tree species, really thin bark. This species has not evolved to have bark as a protective layer. Instead, it really rapidly resprouts in response to fire. So another adaptation that isn't related to bark at all. I think the coolest thing about coast redwood forests when it comes down to it is that they really have a different post-fire recovery trajectory than really any any conifer forest in the world. So when I started working in fire ecology and forest ecology, I was working in forest systems like that on the left, and that's a subalpine conifer forest in Colorado. In these systems, when a high severity fire sweeps through, what we're most interested in when there's a stand replacing event like this is, are there seedlings on the ground? Are there any cones in the vicinity that are going to spread seeds that are going to allow this forest to regenerate and to reestablish in this stand replacing seed dependent system? In contrast, coast redwood forests have this mix of species that sprout really readily from their canopy as well as from their base, and are mixed in with species just like those in the subalpine that are seed dependent, and that's Douglas fir. So we think about the way these systems recover very differently than we think about the way that the Sierra Nevada might recover, or the Rocky Mountains might recover, for example. So let's go ahead and dig into that a little bit more. This trait of epicormic sprouting. This is what was talked about in the news following the CZU complex of the 2020. It's the ability of a tree to regrow its canopy after it's been entirely torched. So this is why we say in coast redwood forests that stand replacing fires are often absent. There's buds underneath the bark of coast redwood trees that are stimulated by fire and are allowed to regenerate the canopy really rapidly. This is a really fantastic adaptation because it literally allows a tree to regrow its canopy and persist in its original place. When you look at the Douglas fir here on the left, it has no potential to resprout from its branches. That tree is gone and dead. And that space is going to have to be refilled by a seedling or potentially by a competing redwood sprout. Another really interesting characteristic of coast redwoods are basal sprouting. So this is a characteristic that, once again, is just incredibly uncommon in most conifer species. This is the characteristic that is attributable to the vast majority of coast redwoods' resilience to the disturbances that we've thrown at them over the past 150 years. The ability to resprout following logging, the ability to resprout following landslides or fire has allowed the rapid regeneration of about 95% of the coast redwood range. So when the parent stem dies, you've already got a head start. You've got a wad of carbohydrates at the base of your tree, a root system that you can feed upon, and these sprouts just come right back up in the place of the parent individual. Once again, not reliant upon the establishment of seedlings. This is a really unique characteristic for conifers, but it's not all that unique in hardwoods. So a number of different hardwood species in the coast redwood range respond to fire through sprouting, including madrone. You can see there with my hand there on the left, just a few years after fire, as well as tan oak, California bay laurel. Many different species have this ability to resprout. A really great adaptation in a post-fire environment. Once again, Douglas fir gets left out. It can't sprout basally, and it really can't sprout epicormically either. So this is one that I put in. This is just a month after the CZU complex. I was surveying, and I was seeing many trees, small trees and large trees resprouting from their base. These sprouts are 6, 8, 10 inches tall, and this environment has absolutely no potential to be supporting seedlings at this point in time. So these trees, coast redwoods and the hardwoods that can resprout so rapidly, they just have this immense competitive advantage over the species that require seedling regeneration to come back. With that said, post-fire seedling recruitment is really important. It's important for Douglas fir because it's its only way to regenerate. But it's important for coast redwood as well, because if you think about basal sprouting or epicormic sprouting, there's no potential in those characteristics for coast redwoods really to move from point A to point B. So seedling establishment in redwood is really important for colonization of new sites, gaps that have been created by the fire, or new climatically suitable conditions, for example. So seedling establishment, a really important component in the regeneration, and it's often overlooked in the Coast Redwood Range, just because sprouting is so ubiquitous. Something many of you have probably encountered if you've headed out to Big Basin following the CZU complex is that fire has a tremendous effect on the understory in Coast Redwood forests. So there's seeds waiting to be activated by fire that have been present since the fire previous. So in the case of much of the Santa Cruz Mountains, we see the Ceanothus thriciflorus that's regenerated rapidly and grown 10 to 15 feet tall. In the northern part of the range, you might see rapid regeneration of rhododendron. And there's also a number of species that we didn't even know existed in the Santa Cruz Mountains prior to the CZU complex that have popped out of the seed bank, been activated by fire that we've never seen before. So that understory response, though relatively temporary in the full scale of the post-fire environment, is really interesting to see, particularly just a few years after fire. So those are some of the traits and responses that specific species have to fire. But when we're thinking about how a system really recovers from fire, we have to think about the fire behavior, and we have to think about fire severity. So coast redwood forests, as I'd mentioned in kind of the fire history section, they typically have this mix of low and moderate and some high severity burned within the footprint of a fire. And within those sites that burn low, moderate, or high, each species is going to respond a little bit differently. And that's also going to alter the recovery trajectory of that system. So I'm going to bring up a graph, and it's not something that I expect you to dig into closely here. But the real idea here is just to show that tree size and burn severity really influence survivorship and post-fire regeneration of two of the core species in the Coast Redwood Range. So on the left, you can see Coast Redwood, and you can see that even at high severity, the vast majority of the trees survive. But it influences their response to fire, the severity. So maybe they'll sprout from the base, maybe they'll sprout from the trunk, or maybe they won't sprout at all, depending upon the size of the tree and the severity of the fire. In contrast, you've got Douglas fir, a non-sprouting species. And you can see as fire severity increases and trees get smaller, that mortality increases dramatically. So I think this contrast is a really powerful example of how species traits and fire severity and tree size really interact to shape post-fire outcomes. I do want to dig in a little bit closer and look at the effects of low and moderate and high severity fire in these systems. Let's go ahead. So I've got a couple pictures here that I think are characteristic of low severity fire in the Coast Redwood Range. What you often see in low severity fire is small tree mortality, so pole-sized tree mortality of both Coast Redwood and Douglas fir, as well as hardwoods like tan oak, for example. In the case of the redwoods and tan oak, those are going to sprout back from the base. In this case, the one species that's really losing out and losing that space that it had in pre-fire conditions is often Douglas fir. Low severity fire also initiates this kind of reduction of understory fuels, that particularly the sticks and the twigs. But low severity fire, you often don't see, a lot of the large down trees significantly affected. Low severity fire can have a significant effect on the shrub layer. It can really rapidly regenerate, however, either by seed or resprouting, depending upon where you are in the range. And in this case, in low severity fire, you often see that large redwood and Douglas fir are largely unaffected. And in redwood, you see little to no sprouting response. In low severity fire, you often don't see basal sprouting, and you often don't see epicormic sprouting at all. In moderate severity fire, that's where you start to see a little bit more change in the canopy component. So moderate severity really starts to result in epicormic sprouting of redwoods, particularly the branches. But one difference I'd say between moderate and high severity fire in coast redwood forests is that in moderate severity fire, you see the branches of coast redwood resprouting. So the fire hasn't been intense enough to actually kill the branches. So in moderate severity fire, you're going to see more rapid recovery of that canopy and the shade and all of those benefits that are provided by that canopy in comparison to when just the bole or the main stem of the tree is resprouting. Going to take a lot longer to recover. Here's where you start seeing larger Douglas fir begin to die. Moderate severity fire, you're still usually not seeing the older growth, largest Douglas fir dying, but you are seeing the vast majority of hardwoods dying and resprouting in this case, even much larger tan oaks, for example. You can start to see some real beneficial habitat elements with moderate severity fire. For example, the formation of basal cavities, which are really important for wildlife, for example. So the low and moderate severity fire characteristics I've just gone over, those are really typical of what prescribed fire typically tries to replicate, reducing the small tree density, reducing the fuels, and kind of refreshing the forest in a way. In contrast, you've got high severity fire, and this is unfortunately what we've been seeing more of in the coast redwood region in the most recent lightning complex in 2020. Here you see Douglas fir mortality of all sizes, including old growth. And this is where we see the community composition of redwood forests changing considerably for the future 20, 40, 60 plus years because of these incredible effects that high severity can have. If we look at the image on the right, this is where a high severity fire swept through in Oregon, and you can see that all of the redwoods lived. Those are the smiley faces, but all of the Douglas fir died. But even the redwoods, you're just seeing resprouting primarily from the bole and not the branches. And so there's going to be a lot of opportunity in this system for new recruitment, new regeneration in those areas where you've got dead Douglas fir, dead standing Douglas fir. But it's going to take a long time for this system to recover. So you've got considerable modification from the forest floor up to the canopy in high severity fire. Still incredibly resilient. You're not seeing a stand replacing fire because you've got those coast redwoods alive, but no doubt that it's significantly modified. So I think what I'm trying to get at here really is that redwood forests are incredibly resilient to fire, but I think it's really important that we don't become complacent to the potential effects that fire can have in these forest systems under modern conditions. And what do I mean by that? I think that why these fires are at most risk and what the literature says at this point in time is that, first, we've excluded fire from these systems for the better part of the last 150 years. We've excluded that regular fire implemented by indigenous forest stewardship, suppressed many of the lightning strikes that have been present over the past 150 years. And what this results in really is more fuel accumulation and more growth of fire intolerant species, like the dense growth of small Douglas fir, for example. This is compounded by, historically intensive logging, which was followed by kind of hands-off stewardship. So don't touch the forest stewardship, which resulted in, incredible regeneration of redwoods, denser, smaller forests. Add climate change to that mix with hotter, drier conditions. Where we are today is modern forest conditions that are really denser, fuel rich, and more prone to high severity fire than ever in the past. And, I think 2020 is really where we saw all of those factors kind of come together. So this is some research that I'm working on right now, just looking at how trends in wildfire burn severity have changed in the coast redwood region over time. And as you can see, over the last 40 years, there's been a number of fires that have occurred. But the vast majority of the fires were that characteristic mix that we think coast redwood has evolved with for quite some time. The low, moderate, with just a smattering of high severity throughout the last 30 or 40 years. Well, in 2020, we really saw a shift to high severity. So there's more acres that were burned in 2020 high severity than had ever been burned in the last 4 decades. And in addition, a lot of the areas that burned a second time, for example, those areas that burned high severity in the 2009 lightning complex, those areas burned at high severity again just 11 years later. So we're seeing this potential for high severity compounded fire in coast redwood forests with younger forests than we've previously had, and we don't really know how they're going to respond. So the question that keeps me up at night really is how the forest system is going to respond if we're seeing higher severity fire more frequently in these forest systems. And just a few things that I'm going to be watching for closely, and also that I've just observed following the CZU complex. The first, of course, is old growth redwood structure and survivorship. There was really impressive survivorship following the CZU complex, but there was also incredible structural modification of a lot of the old growth individuals that are left in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So I've got a picture there of a tree that I call a tripod tree. It's just hanging on, but that tree is alive. It's circled in the yellow circle is some epicormic sprouting. So if you were doing a scientific survey and you were just trying to get at the percentage of individuals that lived, you'd mark that individual as live. But it's really important that we monitor these trees in the long term to see long-term survivorship. And also it's important to think about if a fire does burn through this area again in 10 or so years, what's the tipping point for these individuals? The next thing that we really need to watch closely and consider in our management, I think, is the extirpation of old growth Douglas fir and the loss of habitat features that those individuals provide. So down at the bottom, I've got a quote that's 25 years old, but I think it really shows you the how our perception of the resistance of old growth Douglas fir to fire has changed. Back then, we really thought at one point in time that the largest Douglas fir were incredibly resistant to fire. But following the 2020 complex, we know that there is a point where these trees just simply cannot survive. Also, when it comes to landscape scale, high severity fire, I think we need to keep a close eye on the potential for these forests to capture fog in the next 10, 15 years. Well, Coast Redwood has done an incredible job of regenerating its canopy. Those canopies are nowhere near the surface area that they were in pre-fire conditions. And that's going to potentially alter that hydrology, the hydrology of the system for quite some time, which could have kind of cascading effects on the overall ecosystem and environment in the long term. So those are a few things that are on the top of my mind when we think about higher severity, more frequent fire in the Coast Redwood Range. With all that said, fire is an incredibly important component of Coast Redwood forests. So what we really need to do is try to think about how we can live with and promote that good fire back in these systems. And that's really easier said than done, to be honest. So what we really need to do before we just increase the pace, scale, and frequency of prescribed fire is that we need to be integrating the future of prescribed fire into our stewardship planning now. So that means integrating future prescribed fire with projects where you haven't seen prescribed fire for 100 years, so you need to do a fuels reduction project before you can even consider introducing prescribed fire back into that system. Thinking about creating lines to surround prescribed fires in the future in stewardship projects. Once we start implementing those activities, we can start thinking further about how we can do landscape scale prescribed fire in the Santa Cruz Mountains and throughout the Coast Redwood system. The next thing is, I think that the biggest lesson that I've seen from observing fires from the north to the south is that less dense stands with larger trees are absolutely more resilient to severe fire. They're critically important ecologically, but the vast majority of our forest systems in the Coast Redwood Range are really small and really crowded. So I think it's critical that we accelerate restoration forestry in these systems to promote larger trees, to promote less crowded stands, and to make these forests more resilient to future fires. And I think it's also important that we recognize that when it comes to this, that we might not have time to wait anymore with more frequent, more severe fires for that natural succession to occur over 100 or 150 plus years. The next thing is that old growth trees are, as we all know, rare, and we need to prioritize them in our stewardship plans. And that includes, thinking about old growth out strategies for stewardship and protection, integrating old growth in prescribed fire, forest, and fuels management where appropriate. And then finally, I think it's really important to acknowledge that we're really still learning the best strategies to protect our forests under these modern conditions. So I always try to, encourage testing new forestry and stewardship practices wherever we can, and ensuring that we're conducting intensive monitoring and research on these practices so that we can guide managers to maximize their effectiveness of their efforts, both now and in the future. So with that, I just want to say, I think that we have a real opportunity here. There's this immense spirit of collaboration and innovation and urgency amongst the land management and scientific communities. And I think that with that renewed push, I am confident that we can protect and restore these iconic forest systems. So I want to thank you all for coming out.
Thank you. I have a million questions to ask you. I won't ask you a million questions. But one of the ones that you touched on, but I want to circle back to it because it's one I've been wondering about, is we saw the extirpation locally in Big Basin, for example, of Doug fir. Almost entirely all the Douglas fir were killed by the CZU fire in Big Basin. And, we always talk about nature being a tapestry. And if you just pull out a major thread like Doug fir, to a superficial, casual look observer, it may not look all that different. But I'm curious, do we know what it means to have removed all those Doug fir for the remaining forest and for the resilience of the redwoods going forward? Do we have an understanding of what that means?
Yeah, that's
or
really
for that matter, some of the other species that were taken out by the fire that had been there previously and been part of that natural community.
Yeah, Douglas fir is this really interesting species to consider as a land manager and a scientist, because you've got this picture of the pre-fire condition of Douglas fir. And we know Douglas fir was kind of in places that it wasn't supposed to be in the Santa Cruz Mountains in pre-fire conditions, right? So it's kind of figuring out, why did Doug fir thrive where it did for hundreds of years in these old growth stands, and supporting those individuals where they're supposed to be. And then also thinking about, when there was a more frequent fire in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which areas likely didn't support large populations of Douglas fir. But Douglas fir, we know, is a critically important habitat tree for species like marbled murrelet, for example. So I think that, there could be absolutely cascading ecological effects of the extirpation of that species. And also, there's a lot of beneficial properties of promoting diversity of our forest systems.
Yeah.
So Santa Cruz Mountains, when it comes to tree species, not really the most diverse forest systems as is. I think it would be a huge bummer ecologically to see the loss of those, in my opinion, incredible trees.
Yeah. So it may have consequences, but it's not like fundamentally you think it's going to erode the viability and resilience of the remaining forest necessarily, but it will have some seen or unseen consequences. Is that sort of the key takeaway?
I think you've summed it up well. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. The other thing I wondered about, and you touched on this, but I just want to circle back to this as well. A lot of our supporters and myself looked at the CZU fire and thought, well, this is a catastrophe for humans who were involved, but maybe it was a good thing in terms of being an ecological reset for the forests, the redwood forests in the Santa Cruz Mountains, reducing some of the fuel load, and the hope that future fires won't be as severe. But really, I think my understanding has evolved, and seeing some of the regrowth and some of the understory ceanothus and other things that have come back, it looks pretty darn flammable again to me. And so I wonder two things. One, can you comment on sort of the pace at which this sort of fuel reduction, forest restoration work needs to go to keep up with it? And secondly, if we don't keep up with it, which we are not, and the forests grow back again and they're fairly dense again, and there's another severe wildfire, we had high survival rate for redwoods. But as you noted, it's not clear how healthy those redwoods really are going to be. And if another high severity fire comes through that same fire footprint, say in the next 5 years, what does that mean for those forests? Do we know? So that's a two-part question. One, what do we need to do even right after a major fire to keep up and prevent the next severe fire from happening? And second, if we're unsuccessful at that and another severe fire comes, say, within the decade, do we have an understanding of what that means for the forest ecology?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, stewardship needs to occur pretty much immediately in so many different ways. But in high severity burned areas, there's a lot of opportunity for, I think, fire to come back quite rapidly.
Yeah,
Um,
because of the regrowth.
because of the regrowth, because of the amount of down dead woody fuels,
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so I think that's the contrast with, we had 100+ years of fuel sitting on the landscape. And in some ways you might think like, well, you want high severity fire. That's gonna be what clears that system
right,
out.
right.
But in
One and done.
actuality, I think what it did was it left a lot more fuel on the landscape than if we would have had more of a clear and careful approach like these
Yeah,
forests were stewarded with for, many thousands of years. I don't want to be, I think that there's still a lot of opportunity. I think that it needs to be really strategic, our stewardship, and we really need to
yeah,
identify those values that are most important to us, both culturally, ecologically, and
yeah.
to our communities, and start there with our stewardship actions. Because I mean, we can all acknowledge that the vast majority of the landscape, the management action that we're going to take is no management whatsoever. So
Yeah,
that's why
simply
it's so
because
important.
you can't get to that level of, there's not, that we don't have the reach, even if everybody were to pull together.
Absolutely. But how can we start thinking about the larger scale, the more landscape scale stewardship projects, both in prescribed fire or for more traditional forestry routes, And and also thinking less about fuel reduction and more about forest health in the future,
Yeah,
Um, because fuel reduction is very temporary, whereas trying to build forest health and build forest resilience can be a longer term trajectory towards sustainability of our forests, long in
yeah.
the
Well, and we'll also build resilience for things other than just fire, right? We're looking at increased frequency of drought and other changes that are stressing these forests. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
but so in an ideal world, let's take Big Basin. We have this big fire in the CZU wildfire in 2020. In an ideal world, would we be burning and thinning in that same fire footprint, what, annually following that fire? If we had all the resources in the world and all the political will to just do what needed to be done, what would that
Sure.
look like from a management,
Yeah,
like,
I mean, I think that you do have to take some time. I mean, that system right after the fire is not going to be immediately ready to burn, but I
right?
think within 4 or 5 years that yeah, you should be on the ground reintroducing fire into that system most
Yeah,
likely.
yeah,
And then you likely, I mean, it's going to be a lot of, depending upon the composition of the forest and the structure of the forest that you're working in, you're gonna tailor your approach. But if in old growth stands, in stands adjacent to old growth stands, I think we need to be working in those systems right now in an effort to prevent the big one again. So
and then it's ongoing, right? Just to sort of make our audience fully aware of the scale of what we're talking about.
yes.
It's not one and done or two and done. It's like cutting your hair. Like, you need to do it on a periodic basis.
Yeah,
right? I mean,
absolutely. And that's why I think, the most feasible option long term in the future is going to be the landscape scale prescribed fire. Because
yeah,
even if we wanted to, there would be no way that we could reach the vast majority of the landscape with, a masticator or a machine. So, you've got to start thinking about ways that you can really manage sustainably. And, prescribed fire is really our best tool, and it's a proven tool as well. It's just going to take a
right.
lot of prep work to get there, to get it up to that scale to where we can implement it at scale.
Yeah, and one of the things our team talks a lot about is I think a role that Sempervirens and others can help play is to help the public understand why that prescribed fire, while it may feel or seem scary, and it may be scary if it's your house that's next door to where the prescribed fire application is happening, but why it's so essential for everyone's health and safety and well-being, let alone the forest well-being. And I feel like that public education, that's in part what we're trying to do with things like these webinars, is to help people really understand what's at stake here, and
Yeah.
the level of engagement that's going to be needed. And my understanding, I feel like maybe Dr. Scott Stevens was the one who told us this. Someone I think told us that annually it was estimated that indigenous communities burned almost annually, that there were millions and millions of acres a year burned, prescriptive in their own form of prescriptive burning. And I don't know that we'll ever, in a state this crowded, get back that, but it's just to give folks a sense of the scale of what once was and what we may need to be getting back to.
Absolutely. Yeah. The resprouting is a blessing and a curse for these forest systems because, man, they grow
Right,
back quickly. Absolutely.
right, right. Okay, well, I could ask you a lot more questions, but I'm going to invite Matt to see what kind of questions we may have gotten from our audience.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Woodward. You know, there's a fair number of questions about the human interrelationship with recovering forests. For example, if redwoods have done so well for so many eons, why is it important for humans to actively manage forests with or without fire in this time?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the acknowledgement that, redwood forests are very different today than they once were. And even those forests that, all our old growth today are in conditions that are highly modified, both the vegetation around them, but also the climate that we're living in, that unfortunately we're in a period where active management is really one of our only options, in my perspective. So yeah, it's absolutely an incredibly resilient species, but we have to put it in kind of that modern framework and that modern perspective that we're in.
Well, I think of it as, we kind of mess things up with these forests in a lot of ways, both in the individual forests where we did intensive logging, and then when they regrew, we suppressed fire, but also in the context of climate change and a hotter, drier climate. And so just expecting nature to operate as if it was like the system it had evolved into is not realistic anymore. That's not the system those trees are living or growing in.
Yep, I couldn't agree
So we
more.
got to clean it up. It's like when I tell my kids to clean up the mess they made. It feels a little bit like that.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and it's a huge challenge to consider as well. So
Yeah.
Um, Returning to fire and its relationship with redwoods, one of the reasons it seems that redwoods survived the CZU fire to such a great degree is because the root system survived. Is that what we're understanding? And have we seen fires that are so severe that the redwood roots are impacted as well?
yeah, at localized scales, I think that there's, I mean, either through direct impacts of fire, but also soil erosive conditions that result in the mortality of coast redwood at localized scales as a result of root damage. Definitely can be an issue, but yeah, a huge part of the reason why coast redwoods can survive fire, yeah, is that they're the vast majority of trees have the ability to live through fire. Their roots have the ability to live through fire. So the real incredible component of why coast redwood can live through fire is that ability to sprout from its upper canopy as well as from its base. You know, it's got once again that big wad of carbohydrates at the bottom that's just ready to shoot up sprouts right after fire conditions. But yeah, soil is really important to consider, and I didn't do it justice today, so that's a really great question.
Well, but
Thank
I'm
you.
sobered. I was sobered by that quote you had talking about Doug fir and how I don't know what era it was, but they didn't used to think that Doug fir would be vulnerable. And we're hearing similar things from our friends who focus on the giant sequoia and the Sierra, who thought they were fire adapted, but now they're seeing the trees really not being able to withstand the level of fire that's now happening. And do you think there's concern that over time we will see something analogous with redwoods? Or do you feel like their adaptations are so strong that they will be resilient no matter what?
I don't think, either it's a wait and see type of question for sure.
Yeah,
Do I
yeah,
have concern about that? Absolutely. There's a tipping point for every species. And I think we saw that tipping point in the CZU for a number of old growth individuals that, if it was a characteristic low to moderate severity fire, we wouldn't have seen the structural collapse of some of these old growth individuals that have been present on the landscape for 1,000+ years. So, the
yeah,
CZU complex really, and I'm not saying that wouldn't have happened in other fire events, but the landscape level of that high severity of fire, the effect that it had on these old growth individuals, I think it's really hasn't been seen at any point in time in the past. As far as landscape scale, extirpation of redwood, I don't see it in the near future, but I do see the potential for significant decline and significant decline
yeah.
of the services that those individuals provide. Because if you're just constantly trying to regenerate a canopy, that's no way to live, right?
Right, right. So you may be on life support, but you're not necessarily a happy functioning tree.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Um,
Matt, do you have other questions you want to
I
ask?
do. Yeah. A guest and I heard the same thing and were surprised. So I want to make sure I heard this right. And if so, if you could say more about it. It sounded like you said that redwood bark is semi-flammable and may have evolved as a means of spreading fire, perhaps to other trees like Doug firs. Is that what we heard?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a hypothesis, that we've got in the scientific community that You know, a lot of folks might have learned in the past that coast redwood bark and needles are not flammable. Well, I'll just tell you right now, that's not true. Redwood bark is incredibly flammable. You can have a flame length of 4 or 6 inches in a prescribed fire, and you can see fire just racing up a redwood tree to a very, it's wick-like, so it goes out fairly rapidly. It's not burning into the inner tissues of the tree, but it is going up into the canopy of the tree. The reason for that, beyond that, is just a hypothesis. If you've got two species in a community, a really fire tolerant species like redwood, and you've got a species like Douglas fir that just has every opportunity to die if you get fire into its canopy. What a potentially amazing opportunity to get some more space for your species
You're
if
saying it's
you're killing
killing
them
the
and then
Doug
you are
firs?
affected them. So it's something I've considered. I've seen it happen in post-fire conditions. It's one of those things that's really hard to prove, but there's no doubt that coast redwood bark is really flammable, both the old growths and young individuals, and it kind of acts like a wick, and you can see the fire go right up the tree. I've got some really great videos of that I'd love to share in the future. So.
We could probably put those on our website. I'm sure people would be interested. I've
Absolutely.
never heard that before. I mean, I've never heard that theory that it's somehow it's a
Sure.
competitive advantage to take out your weaker neighbor by tossing fire over to them.
Yeah, and it's really, when you think about it, that gives a really great opportunity for the coast redwood seedling establishment, create that big gap, enter that gap by establishing a seedling. You're directly competing with that Douglas fir seedling for space. Who
Boom.
knows? Yeah.
Well, Matt, I want to take the prerogative to ask the last question. I know I'm mindful of time here, but Brian, you know, these issues are so sobering sometimes, right? And I think people had mixed reactions to the CZU fire. Oh, I'm coming out of focus. In terms of whether they felt hopeful or not. But can you just close us out with some thoughts about how are you feeling about sort of the future of redwoods in our region? Are you feeling hopeful because you see so many people coming together and starting to really understand the change in management practices that need to happen? Are you daunted by the scale of the task ahead of us? Like where are you at in your thinking as you look to the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think of it kind of like, if we characterize the last 100 years as kind of the conservation movement of redwoods, I'd like to characterize the next 100 years as kind of the true restoration movement of redwoods. So I just imagine if we had all the energy that we've placed into conserving the incredible diversity of properties that we have throughout the Redwood Ridge over the last 100 years, if we pour that energy now into restoring these systems to what they once were, I think there's incredible potential for these systems to be long resilient into the future, well outside of my lifetime, your lifetime, and our children's lifetimes. So it just takes active management, and I think a positive outlook and a real commitment to stewardship, and that's going to take all types of things, both the attitude, the funding, and the will. So.
Well, you're warming the cockles of my heart. We are finishing up and we'll be releasing to this audience and others our strategic plan for Sempervirens' next 125 years. And I didn't plant you to say what you just said, but in essence, I would describe our strategic plan as a recognition that the threat that the forests face today is very different than it was 125 years ago. Today, it's climate change and high severity fire more than it is clear-cut logging, but that the threat is no less existential, and that the answers really are very different than what we used in the past, and that while we can and should still be acquiring land to preserve it, we are right there saying stewardship, active management, forest restoration is what has to be at the very core of what Sempervirens takes on in certainly the next decade or more, if we're going to see these forests have a chance. So I think we're very much of like mind. And yeah, I'm left hopeful that so many people are talking about it, seeing it. I'm hopeful that our audience has come along with us on it and is not panicking when we talk about things like the need to log to thin forests. So we've come a long way, but the work ahead is significant. So anyway, well, thank you. Thank you for being both a great presenter and for serving on our Land and Stewardship Committee. Your wisdom is really a welcome addition to our team. And we'll be very interested, and I'm sure we'll invite you back to hear about some of the results of the research and issues that you alluded to that we and others need to be studying. And so to our audience, thank you for joining us for another in our Under the Redwoods webinar series. I hope you enjoyed your time with us and enjoyed Dr. Woodward's expertise. And please join us in May. We're going to have another researcher. Zane Moore will be joining us. For those of you who saw the film Giants Rising, he was in that film. He is a geneticist who looks at the genetics of redwoods and thinks about what that tells us about how we can best manage and preserve these forests. So thank you for joining us. Thank you again to Scharf Investments for supporting this webinar series. And we'll look forward to seeing all of you again under the Redwoods next month. So thank you.
Thank you all.